Well, well, well. What a debacle we found ourselves in last night while watching the Oscars. And I wasn't even watching them, I just heard about it on the radio, so then I tuned in. But I think what we saw yesterday, it's an example of what happens as a man when you don't practice radical self-respect in your relationships. And it's a prime example of exactly what to watch out for. So when a guy is going to be weak and in his woman's frame, it's a problem. And we saw that last night, how it can be a problem. But let's rewind here. So Jada, they had all that table talk stuff, right? And she put all of their business out there. There was no reason for her to do that. If I were Will, I would have tolerated that. I wouldn't have tolerated a lot of things. At any time in this, Will could have put his foot down and had a boundary and walked away. But when push came to shove, he didn't. And every time he didn't, she lost a little more respect in Jada's eyes, so that now you see she's in complete control of the relationship. So let's go back to last night, because that was the precursor to all of this. I think Will felt emasculated, which he was, and he has a lot of anger because he's been the butt of a lot of jokes. Yep, that's also very true too. So last night, as you saw in the thumbnail there, Will is with Jada, and Jada has on this humongous green dress, screaming basically that she wants attention. And also, I'm not going to diagnose anyone with anything in this, but I will say Jada certainly displays a lot of cluster B traits, narcissistic traits to be exact. And so she wears this big green dress on a night that's supposed to be her man's night. He's the one nominated for Best Actor, not Jada. But even so, she kind of tries to steal his shine just with the dress to begin with. And I've heard narcissistic mothers do this with their daughters on their wedding days. I've heard the narcissistic mother will even wear a wedding dress to their daughter's wedding. And so here it is on this night. It's supposed to be about Will, and Jada can't even put herself to the side for a minute to let it really be about Will. And she wears this outlandish dress. That's a strike one. So then we go into the actual thing here. Chris Rock is a comedian. Comedians roast people. That is what they do. They make fun of others. And the worst part about this was Will laughs at the G.I. Jane joke at first, which I don't even think it's so bad. I don't think a G.I. Jane joke is really that bad. And I'll explain why I think that in a minute. But so Will laughs at it at first. But then he looks out of the corner of his eye and he sees Jada all upset. And this is the part that really annoys me, is that he let her dictate his whole emotional state. She tells him how he should be feeling and how he should be reacting and responding. So he sees her upset and his whole emotional state changes because he's enmeshed. He's codependent. He has a trauma bond. And how Jada feels is the dominant frame in the relationship. And this is what happens. This is why, as a man, you can't trust a guy who their woman is in charge of their relationship. If the woman has the strongest frame in the relationship, that's a guy that I can't trust for reasons we're about to see. We saw it. So when a guy puts emotion before logic, you see what happened there. Will Smith slaps Chris Rock. That's what happens when you put emotion before logic. To me, the correct way to handle it on Will's side long ago would have been to leave. But in last night's situation, it would be, you're laughing at it. That's how you felt. You thought it was funny. So own it. Own the fact you thought it was funny and tell Jada, hey, relax. It's just a joke. Chris Rock is a freaking comedian. It's what they do. And to escalate. Instead, all it took was that look and he went off in overdrive. And don't get it wrong here. I'm all about standing up for your woman in some scenarios, right? Someone put your hand on your woman, knock them out. Absolutely. If someone's harassing your woman in public and it's malicious, absolutely. Stand up for yourself and do something about it. But you gotta know your situation. You gotta know the surroundings. And in this situation, what Will Smith did was out of touch. It was uncalibrated, and it just seemed inappropriate. Because back to cluster B traits here, narcissists are very sensitive to criticism, And notoriously, they're not very good at laughing at themselves. And I mean, and Jada Smith, she's got the world, she's on top of the world. And you're going to let a little G.I. Jane joke bother you that badly? That's some pretty bad sensitivity to criticism there, if you ask me. And so that's a problem. And that's why Will, he shouldn't be there to begin with. But he let her dictate the frame, and then he did that. And so I think Will, he thinks he has a lot to prove. It's kind of like how Paulie in Goodfellas tells Henry, you got to watch out for Tommy. He's a cowboy. He's got too much to prove. And that's what Will Smith has done here too. He's got too much to prove. He's trying to prove and overcome all the emasculating stuff that happened a long time ago. And so he did this. But in reality, he's got to just own it. Own your situation, dude. If you thought it was funny, don't let her dictate how you're thinking and feeling. When I make friends with guys, if their woman's in charge, that's not a guy I can trust in the heat of battle. That's not a guy I can trust to put logic before emotion. That guy, he's controlled by his woman. I don't want men like that in my life that are controlled by their woman. I want the guys in my life that they're the ones that have the strong frame. Those are the guys that I respect the most. They're the guys that I can trust to be there and to rely on. The guys that are like Will, you can't trust a man like that. And so, again though, this is what happens as a guy. You stay with a woman that's displaying toxic behaviors, but you stick it out for whatever reason. This is what happens. And Jada has dragged Will through the dirt for a long time, embarrassed him in public. It's sad. It's sad, but this is what happens when someone doesn't practice radical self-respect. They get put in these terrible situations. And Will is to blame, though, here, too, because no one's holding a gun to his head to stay there. It's up to him to do something different. And he's got a lot of misplaced anger right now, that with all the crying, memes, and etc. And he put it on Chris Rock there. But honestly, I think Chris Rock handled it best of all. He just got smacked in front of millions of people, and then he didn't even have an emotional reaction. He played it off, and he was able to put logic above emotion. So bravo to Chris Rock for being able to do that. And back to the alopecia thing. So some people were saying, Jada has alopecia. That's a medical condition. And let's Google. When you Google alopecia, what do you find? You find that alopecia is a fancy word for balding. That's what alopecia is. You could maybe say autoimmune disorder that causes balding, but it's really a fancy word for balding. Now, granted, a woman balding is a little more of a sensitive topic than a man balding. But even so, that is not a life-threatening condition. To me, it's fair grounds to be poked at. Maybe slightly poor taste, but to have the kind of reaction that occurred because of that from a comedian, you gotta know your situation and surroundings. The men I would respect the most, a Jocko. Could you imagine, a real tough dude taking a joke that seriously and then slapping the host of the Oscars? It's ridiculous. And that's why this whole thing seemed ridiculous, because it was way uncalibrated. This is what happens, though. When a man's in his woman's frame, they do stupid things. And again, I'm all for standing up for your woman in certain scenarios. This just wasn't one of those scenarios. Chris Rock was not trying to be malicious about it. It wasn't a situation where Jada was in any danger, so no one was really harassing her in public, people they didn't know. No one was putting their hands on her. Those are areas where I would say it's certainly okay to be violent. This situation was none of those, and so the reaction was out of proportion. And Will, he's got to get a handle on this, man. He needs to get to the red pill. He needs to practice radical self-respect. And that will solve a lot of his issues. And a lot of this comes down to also, what do we value? What do we value as men? And to me, what I value is a guy that can put logic before emotion. A guy that can do the right thing regardless of how he feels. And in this scenario, he should know that This was not an appropriate response. The appropriate response is to laugh it off with Jada and say, like, hey, that's kind of ridiculous. Because since Jada is so sensitive to jokes and criticism, she dictated the whole scenario. And it was poison. It was poisonous for Will. And it's Will's fault for being in the situation too. And that's why when someone's displaying a lot of cluster B traits, narcissistic traits, no good will come out of it as a man. I know a lot of dudes watch this channel because they've had experience with cluster B women. And honestly, Jada seems a lot like a cluster B woman. I'm not going to diagnose her as such, but she is certainly displaying a lot of traits. And Will's stuck in the trauma bond. So what happens when you're stuck in the trauma bond? You gotta go no contact. And you gotta learn how to work on yourself, practice radical self-respect, have boundaries, learn how to say no, stand up for yourself, own your emotions, own you. So again, what really bothered me about this whole thing was Will's initial reaction was not to be upset. It wasn't until he looked at Jada that he realized he should be upset. And again, if Will was just mad at it from the get, it still would have been a little ridiculous. But I would at least would have had more respect for it because it was how he felt and he owned it. Instead, that wasn't how he felt. That was just him acting as a robot of Jada's frame. Again, I know men who are stuck in their woman's frame, and it's a pathetic place to be. And I should maybe not be so hard on them, because I've been in the scenario years ago too. But we all gotta learn sometime. Like, I'm 37. Will Smith, Christ, he's probably gotta be pushing 50 by now, and he still hasn't learned it. But this is what happens. When we don't practice radical self-respect, bad stuff happens. And you get put in these terrible situations. And these cluster B women, they like it. They love it, I should say, when a guy does something like that for their honor. It's kind of like a white knight gone amok. But as a guy, you got to know the right place for that. You got to know the right scenario. You got to be calibrated. And that's not what this was. He was not calibrated. This was not a situation where Chris Rock's like really malicious. It's not a situation where Jada's really in danger. And again, I think a lot of people are overly sensitive. There's a lot of narcissism out in the world right now. A lot of sensitivity to criticism. A lot of inability to laugh at oneself. And I think that was on display as well. Like, how dare you make fun of her medical condition? How dare you? He deserved to be smacked. It's like, are we really going to say that balding is a medical condition? Is that really what we're saying right now? We're saying that balding's a medical condition? I mean, if that's the case, I mean, people have been making fun of balding, in men in particular, for a long, long time. And granted, it's a little more of a sensitive topic when it comes to women, but even so, like, just too much. Just too much. And that always reminds me of Sam Harris's quote. And he said this, and I want to get it right here. Let's see. So Sam Harris said, and this is in regards to something else, but it's still spot on. He goes, "Your capacity to be offended isn't something I or anyone else needs to respect. Your capacity to be offended isn't something you should respect. In fact, it's something you should be on your guard for, perhaps more than any other property of your mind. This feeling can mislead you." And again, no one needs to respect someone else's ability to be offended. And this is where masculinity comes into play. A guy who has solid masculinity, he'll say, listen, this is just a joke. Chris Rock's a comedian. He's not really trying to be an ass about it. Know your surroundings. Instead, you're coming off as ridiculous because you're whipped, you're in her frame, and all the other and you're in the trauma bond. And so again, I shouldn't be so hard on him because I've been there myself, but it is still annoying to see. It's annoying to see it in real time. But this is what happens. And so a true, strong masculine would know, hey, you look at your woman and you say, hey, I get you're upset, but sometimes there's a time and a place. And sometimes we got to be able to laugh at ourselves. If anything, Jada proved that she has an extremely fragile ego, an extremely sensitive ego. And guess what that is? Certainly a narcissistic trait, that's for sure. And again, though, but that's what happens. That's what happens when we allow ourselves to be with those kinds of women. They drag us down. There is no way around it. Their energy and their emotions, that's what happens. And we become like the people we surround ourselves with. And people who display a lot of cluster B traits, they're just not going to have an overall healthy attitude towards life. They're not going to have a lot of humility. They're going to be seeking all sorts of attention, putting all of your business out there, giving you some gaslighting, giving you some word salad, trying to steal your shine on the night of the Oscars, airing out all of your dirty laundry in the red table talks. Like, is that really what you want? You want your woman so eager for the spotlight you're going to put your whole news on blast? That is certainly not the radical self-respect way. The radical self-respect way is private relationships are good relationships. And I get it. I've talked about some of my relationships on here, but I kind of wish I didn't at this point. But they did seem to help a lot of people, so there's that. But private relationships moving forward are generally healthier relationships. To put everything on blast like that, out of control. So to sum things up here in a nice little bow, I get, on one hand, Will did do something. It took him a long time to do anything, but he did do something. But when you're in your woman's frame and you're kind of a weak dude, you do things with all the wrong timing. This was out of place. It was out of touch. It wasn't the right time or place to do this. The right time or place to do this was something like, and to stand up for yourself, was at that red table talk. To stand up for yourself then. Practice radical self-respect then. Then this whole thing could have been avoided. You wouldn't have been dragged through the mud. You wouldn't have been emasculated as you were. But instead, you let yourself be disrespected. She dragged you through the mud. You're in the trauma bond. You're in her frame. What she thinks is what you think. What she feels is what you feel. That's codependency as well. And nothing good comes out of that as a man. And it's really difficult to respect a man in that scenario. Because a man has to be above that. A man has to have strong frame. He's got to practice radical self-respect. He's got to own everything about himself. And Will does not meet that criteria one bit. And it's sad, though. It's sad. And maybe I should have a little more compassion about it, because I disrespected myself for a long time, too. But sometimes people need some tough love. They kind of need a kick in the ass a little bit. And that's pretty much what Will needs at this point. He needs a kick in the ass. And honestly, I don't see too much good coming from him sticking around with Jada. Not a lot of because of the narcissistic traits, cluster B traits, the trauma bond. Like, he needs to be out on his own. Like, discover who you are again, man. Get some independence. Own it. Be okay on your own. Develop some boundaries. Develop some assertiveness. Have a backbone. Just, what a fiasco. Well, let's read some of the comments here. Will's anger boiled over and ended up directed at the wrong person. He should have just divorced her back when the August situation happened. The entanglement. He obviously would have had many better options. Yeah, absolutely true. Absolutely true. So a lot of this anger is certainly misplaced, like I've been saying. Misplaced on Chris Rock. And Chris Rock's a comedian. Like, they roast people. It's what they do. It's a sense of health to be able to laugh at yourself and joke at yourself. And if Jada can't do that, after all the millions they have and the fame and the fortune they have, that says a lot about her. And they'll say, oh, but you should never joke about a medical condition. What if it was cancer? It's like, it was not cancer, though. Alopecia is a fancy word for balding. An autoimmune disorder at worst. But that's fair grounds. Fair grounds. Excellent commentary. Oh, thanks, my man. Definitely appreciate it. I get passionate about these kind of topics here because it's annoying to see a man disrespect himself. It's annoying because I've been there myself, and it reminds me how I have disrespected myself in the past and let stupid nonsense like that happen. But let me tell you a little something that happens when we practice radical self-respect and we really integrate it into our own lives and we're congruent with it. That energy radiates and we repel that cluster B nonsense. Because basically, when we do that, our codependency melts away. And we start to have firm boundaries. The enmeshment goes away. Trauma bonds become impossible. And those are the rewards of practicing radical self-respect. You're good. You're good on your own. Your energy, people sense it and feel it, and they're much more hesitant to mess with you because they know you have the ability to say no. And ultimately, a lot of this comes down to you have the ability to be alone. Because that's the one thing I see prevent a lot of people, men and women alike, from practicing radical self-respect. They're afraid to be alone. When you're afraid to be alone, you'll put up with all sorts of nonsense. I always say, you gotta choose peace over avoiding loneliness. And I think Will is experiencing the consequences of not doing that right now. When you don't choose peace, when you don't practice radical self-respect, your name gets dragged to the dirt, you get emasculated, you become the butt of tons of jokes, you live in your woman's frame, you lose the trust of other men. And honestly also, the men in Will's life kind of need a kick in the ass too, for co-signing all of that if they have been. They should have been on him a while ago. Like if you have strong men in your life, they gotta say something to you about that stuff like that. Those are the kind of friends that I want. The guys that can call you out a little bit and call you out on your crap. Maybe Will doesn't have that though. In fact, maybe a lot of dudes don't have that anymore. They don't have a good solid tribe of dudes. And that's why they get stuck with cluster B women. That's why it's like Harry. If Harry has guy friends out there, they should be doing this. Because you think this was bad, Harry and Meghan, a situation like that could arise too. And with Harry, it could be even worse. But this is what happens. Men, hold accountable other men. Help them to practice radical self-respect. Show them the way. And sometimes it's not always easy, because a lot of times people aren't ready to hear it until a dramatic event happens. But look at the consequences of not. That's what I'll say here. So, I think that's all I got here for today. Remember, this is what happens when you're stuck in a trauma bond and you don't practice radical self-respect. You let your emotions rule you, and worse, though, you let your woman's emotions rule you. Sad. Sad indeed. So, thanks for watching, everybody. Have a good one.